Nau mai haere mai ki te karanga o te whenua. I'm Jade Gibson, and today we're with Kiri Nehua, scholar, farmer and guardian of Hūruiki Maunga, near Whangaruru in Te Tai Tokerau. This is a story about land loss and land return. For Kiri and her husband Brandon, that return was a literal and life-changing moment.
Ko Hūruiki te maunga tū te pō tū te ao. Ko Ngāti Hoki uta, ko Ngāti wai ki tai. Ko Kiri Nehua tōku ingoa, he ori a hau no te Rarawa, te Aupōuri, te aroa me Ngāpuhi. Hoki, I noho ana au ki Matapauri, kei roto I te koro ai o Ngāti wai. So Hūruiki is situated between Whangaruru and Hukurangi. It is the maunga for Ngāti Hau and Ngāti wai, and it is the highest point on the east coast of Te Tai Tokerau. Stands at 465 metres. It is ecologically, physically, spiritually and culturally important to the whānau and hapu in that area. It is a story of land loss and alienation, and it is a story that shows the greater injustices that have happened in Aotearoa to date. Through the actions and inactions of Crown led to the land alienation in 1961. So if we go back to 1835, he whakaputanga, if we come through 1840, the signing of Te Tiriti, and then into the 1860s, so after the land wars, we look at the concept of land ownership. And that concept was something that was different to our Māori worldview, because before that, there is no way you can own it or have title over it. But through the Native Land Court, through the 1865 Native Land Court Act, this concept was introduced. Whānau members' names were put on to be the title owners. And for Hūruiki, that was about 100 people's names, but actually they represented their greater whānau and hapu. Through various acts and continuous actions, what you can see now is the process of land alienation, which eventually happened in 1961. In the 1900s was introduced a concept of leasing. What happened with Hūruiki was that the leasing meant that even though your name might be on the title, you actually ended up having to lease back because it was believed Māori didn't know how to look after their whenua. So they were taught how to do this by these Pākehā farmers. And so Māori had to lease their own land back.
The injustice wasn't just systematic, it was documented. Brandon's grandfather was treated differently to his Pākehā neighbour in every way that mattered.
My husband Brandon, his grandfather was one of the lessees, and he was the largest lessee at the time. He was trying to make ends meet. These district boards, they controlled both the levers. They controlled how much you paid and they controlled how much you could earn. And so it was always sort of an inevitable space where you'd get to where you were never earning enough money. What happened, as happened for many people, is that whānau got into a space of rates arrears. So 3 years they couldn't pay their rates. And in the case of Hūruiki, Brandon's grandfather, he saw that his neighbour, who was a Pākehā neighbour who was leasing off a Māori block, he was able to do things that Kiri Nehua was not allowed to do. This information was actually only found out through the Waitangi Tribunal process, and what was found were double standards. The next door neighbour, he could fell his trees and he was able to make money from felling these trees. However, Brandon's grandfather was hit with an injunction and his logs and all his equipment got seized. And so it's this perpetual case of not having enough money. The land was taken. However, the neighbour was able to purchase the block. He wrote a letter to the district council and he said, I am an upstanding European and I will be good for the rates going forward. Well, he got the rates in arrears waived.
100 whānau members lost their land and were forced to move away for the very reason the Pākehā neighbour had his debt waived.
100 whānau members lost their maunga for the very reason of rates arrears, and yet the Pākehā neighbour next door, he was able to buy it. In 1961, the land was alienated. We were very lucky. We were able to buy that whenua back in 2011, exactly 50 years later. in between that time when it was alienated, it was actually converted from Māori title to general title. In that 50 years, there were subsequent owners. A couple of them were developers wanting to break it up into like 20-acre lifestyle blocks. We'd actually tried to buy the maunga back in 2001. We were part of a tender process, but we weren't successful. And it had always been a dream of my husband's, because his father had spoken about this whenua that had been alienated from their whānau. So we went off overseas, young professionals. We had our children overseas, and then we were back in 2011, and we were standing on a farm opposite Hūruiki, and we looked over at Hūruiki, and it was glowing. The maunga was glowing. And so my husband said, I might just see what's happening with Hūruiki. Long story short, it was about to come up for sale, and we were in the right space, and we were able to buy the maunga back. I guess it's one of those things where the tūpuna looked down. And so since 2011, and we were still living overseas at that time, we were in Singapore, and after we got the maunga back, my husband was like, that's us. We're going home. And I was like, I'm not ready yet. So we spent a few more years overseas, and then we came back in 2013. And I guess that's really where our story starts. That has been the beginning of a journey of healing, of reconnection. Hoki ki o maunga kia puri ai koe na hau e Tāwhirimātea. Return to your mountain to be cleansed by the winds of Tāwhirimātea. And for us, that's a whakatauki that speaks to not only us physically returning to the maunga, but it's figurative, because if we are lucky enough to be able to go and stand on our maunga, then we can understand who we are, where we have come from, and where we are going. So our whakaaro is that if you whakapapa to Hūruiki, no mai haere mai. Come and stand on your maunga and be cleansed by the winds of Tāwhirimātea.
Coming home began a process of learning, including learning the full story of what had been done and why. The Waitangi tribunal hearings were where that truth finally surfaced.
Brandon's cousins had put in a claim within the tribunal hearings, but when Brandon spoke to his cousins, they were like, oh, the lawyers don't know what to write. And there's only 5 days to go. So Brandon actually went and basically camped at the Māori Land Court. And it was during that time that he was able to unpack and see the different acts, the injunction, the rates arrears, the letter back to the council, which talked about that they got waived for the new Pākehā owner. And so it was then that a real understanding was able to happen. And then not long after that, we had a family reunion up on the maunga. Brandon was able to share what he learnt. And that was a real place of healing. You could sort of feel a real heavy sense of mamai. And ever since then, you can feel that lift, and you can feel this sense of hope. We've been humbled. We now breed Angus cattle up there. Our philosophy in terms of our farming practices is going back to our Māori worldview. And I guess that creation story is really important, because if we see where we are placed as humans in that creation story, we are the pōtiki. Everything else is our tuakana. And so we have to always remember that, because if we don't remember our place, then I guess we can get ahead of ourselves and think that we know all the answers. All our answers are within our Taiao. One of my favourite whakatauki is ko te reo tuatahi, ko te reo te Taiao. So the first language of this land is the language of the Taiao, and that is interpreted through us, through te reo Māori. So we're all on a journey to learn our reo, but for us to understand our whenua, it's really important, because that is one of the languages it speaks to us in. Hūruiki used to be part of one of the largest kauri forests in Aotearoa in the world. And so we are trying to bring back native forests. So currently we've planted about 70,000 native trees. So 70,000 trees goes into about 20 hectares, and we've got another 100 hectares to go of planting. Why we need to bring back our ngahere is because Hūruiki is part of the easternmost catchment of the Kaipara Harbour, the largest harbours in the southern hemisphere. We have to ensure that that water is clean when it leaves Hūruiki. One of the things that we really enjoy is when we have trees to plant that we open it up for whānau. Sometimes we have whānau up there and then they say they don't want to leave because being able to walk your whenua and plant trees on your maunga so that your mokopuna can come and enjoy the shade of those trees is a really beautiful thing. One of the pou we have put in the ground is that we will only plant natives back on Hūruiki.
Kiri recently completed her dissertation, built on 12 years of learning that Hūruiki had shared with her and Brandon.
So I recently finished my studies and I wrote my dissertation on the lessons that Hūruiki has shared with us. The first lesson was around interconnectedness and interdependence. So ko te au, te Taiao, ko te Taiao ko au. That talks about how everything in the Taiao is related and connected, and we are part of that. We are the pōtiki in that space. Everything we do will have consequences, and so we cannot separate ourselves. So when we talk about things like climate change and resilient and adaptable, we need to understand that we are just as much part of that. The second lesson was about communication. And this communication happens all the time in the Taiao. Ko te reo tuatahi, ko te reo o te Taiao. And that speaks of our tūpuna being attuned, our tūpuna speaking the language of the land. One way they did that was through te reo Māori, but also being able to listen and hear and feel the Taiao. The third lesson spoke about multiple truths. So the Western science paradigm always is seeking the one truth. But if we understand it from our Indigenous worldviews, we can see it as nuanced and that there can be multiple truths happening at the same time and they can all be true. I use the example of gorse. So we can all look at gorse as a evil, but actually it is our biological ally. It is a tangata tiriti. It has a purpose. You know, it's a nitrogen fixer, and it's actually a nursery crop as well. So we can't just take the one truth that it is bad and we need to spray it and get rid of it. But we do use it as a nursery crop, and it feeds our bees, but it also fixes our whenua. The fourth lesson talks about balance. So when we think about balance, the Taiao is always trying to come back to the equilibrium, and sometimes as humans we get in the way. And really our job as humans is actually to do the least harm. One of the best things we can do is actually just get out of the way, because reality is we're one of the most destructive species on this whenua. We need to humble ourselves and sometimes just sit down and be quiet. It's that ability to renewal, and our whenua will come back into balance if we allow it to. The fifth concept is Hoki Maunga, kia purea ai koe e ngā hau e Tāwhirimātea. So return to your mountain. And that's not just talking about returning to our mountain, but returning to our ways of being. And Papa Rao always talks about don't just talk about them, live them, practice them, because otherwise they'll get lost. You actually have to bring these practices into being. So returning to our way of being, living our mana motuaki in tino rangatiratanga. And then the final concept I spoke about was recognizing the sacred and divine. Because if we can recognize the sacred and divine in the Taiao, then we can recognize it in ourselves. Those were the lessons that I have learnt from sitting and listening to our maunga speak. Our generation has a bit of baggage. The generation before us has a lot more baggage. But this new generation, they go forth with a steadfast. They are raised in their tikanga. And when you see it through their eyes, there's a lot of hope there. Rangatahi that have been raised in a kāinga, that have been raised with their kaumātua around, that have been raised with those teachings. It's where you see resilience, adaptability, joy and hope. Te whānau manihira composed a waiata for us. We asked them to compose this waiata because we were heading over to the Healing Our Spirits conference, and it was held in Vancouver in 2023. And what we presented on was how getting your land back heals you. And so they wrote this beautiful waiata for us and performed it. And it talks to that journey of loss and then reconnection. And one of the most beautiful lines at the end is it speaks of how I will never be lost now that my maunga is no longer lost. It's a beautiful moment, and they've blessed us in many ways.
Whenua.